So Kevin, I wanted to start off with maybe just a 2-minute synopsis for folks out there in podcast land that have never even heard of sensory deprivation float tanks and what they're all about. Like, what's a quick summary of what's going on with this stuff?
So the sensory deprivation tank, a flotation tank, it describes a lot of different styles of units, but essentially flotation tanks are light-proof and soundproof chambers that have about 10 to 12 inches of water in the bottom, and that water is saturated with anywhere from 800 to 1,200 pounds of Epsom salt, depending on the size of the tank. But they come in different styles. There's a what's called a pod, which looks kind of like an egg, opens like a clamshell, and there's traditional float tanks that are just kind of rectangular, 4 feet wide, 4 feet tall, 8 feet long. And then there's flotation rooms like the ones we use, which are larger walk-in units. So they're 6 feet wide, 8 feet long, and 7 feet tall. They all basically do the same thing. The idea here is to attenuate sensory input during your session. So no light, no sound. The saltwater solution is heated to what we call skin receptor neutral. So that's right at 93.5 degrees. Your skin register, the solution is being hot or cold. It just becomes neutral. So after you're in there for a few minutes, you lose the sensation. And then, of course, the fact that you're in this highly saturated solution, you're buoyant. You float just in the top 2 or 3 inches of the water. So no light, no sound, no temperature, and no gravity. And when we're in the flotation tank, we're taking about 90% of the workload off of your brain and your central nervous system. I read an article recently that said at any given moment, there's 400 million bits of information available to your mind, which seems a little outrageous, but if you just take a snapshot wherever you are right now, take a quick snapshot of what's going on around you, and you have light, you have sound, you have air movement, you have temperature, you have gravity, you have the color of the plants in the background, the fruit in the bowl on the table, the color of my shirt, the color of the background. Like, if you start to add it up, there's a lot of information coming in. Right. So we get in the flotation tank, we restrict that sensory input, freeing up resources that the brain and central nervous system were using to process all this incoming information. Now those resources are available for us to do other work that we don't normally have the resources to do.
Right. And so can you talk a little bit about the history? If there's anything really interesting or fascinating about the history of sensory deprivation tanks, and also how are people most commonly using them today?
So the history is pretty interesting. So there's a neuroscientist named John Lee who worked for the National Institute of Health. And in 1954, to study the effects of sensory deprivation on the brain. So the first flotation tanks were very, very crude, very primitive, but actually invented in 1954. Then they were used to do all kinds of research. The prevailing thinking of time was that if the human brain was cut off from sensory input, you would just kind of go into a coma, that the brain would just basically shut down with nothing to do. What Lilly discovered in his early research was that it was quite the opposite of that the brain actually responded in some very positive and active ways when it was cut off from sensory input. Primarily, we know that things like stress hormones go down, neurotransmitter production goes up, endorphin production goes up, blood pressure goes. There's a whole cascade of physiological effects that happen when you're in the tank. At the end of the 50s into the early 60s, the flotation tanks were being used to not only research the human brain, but also researching some of the psychedelic compounds that were coming on the scene. So they were doing investigations with LSD, with mescaline, MDMA, like all kinds of different compounds, to learn what those compounds were doing to the brain in the absence of sensory input. Then in the mid to late 70s, there was an attempt to make the flotation tanks a commercial venture. That's when a gentleman named Glenn Perry came onto the scene, and he helped Dr. Lilly sort of fine tune the physical tank. So like the kind of salt that was used in it, a different kind of enclosure that would make it more comfortable for people. And by the early 80s, there was the first attempt to commercialize putting float tanks into what essentially amounts to a float spa or a float center, which is typically how people are using them today. That first attempt at commercializing it failed because of the AIDS outbreak in the mid to late 80s.
Right.
You're probably old enough to remember, some people may not be, but when the AIDS crisis hit, no one understood how it was transmitted. So people weren't drinking out of drinking fountains. They weren't touching doorknobs. It was very scary. So the idea of getting into shared water like you would in a flotation tank or a swimming pool or whatever, it cratered the whole industry, and essentially all but just a handful of commercial float centers went away. In about 2010, 2011, there's a few celebrities that started really advocating for the use of the float tanks, primarily Joe Rogan, Duncan, Trusse, Christopher Ryan. These guys were like, really actively talking about the benefits of flotation tanks. And it started a whole revival in the industry. By 2012, 2013, we were seeing a couple hundred float centers a year opening around the world. And that's essentially where we are now. That's how most people are accessing the float tank now, is through float centers and commercial spas.
Okay, awesome. So many questions for you. The first one is, okay, so the last few years, there's been such a resurgence in using psychoactive compounds for a variety of positive purposes, from treating PTSD to therapist-assisted psychedelic trips for personal development. I would imagine that with that resurgence, there's been a ton of additional experiences that people have been having using psychedelics or marijuana or some sort of substance in combination with the float tanks. So has there been any progress with, say, either best practices for people who are interested in doing that sort of thing, or any studies that have been done, scientific, studies to see exactly what's going on and how we can best use that combination of things, either with the substances or even without it, just straight float tank experiences?
Yeah, so that's an interesting conversation. I did a lot of personal experimentation with different psychedelics in the float tanks, and now certainly they were studied in a laboratory setting. Like I said earlier, when Dr. Lilly was doing that in the late 50s and early 60s, I did quite a lot of that kind of personal research in the mid 80s when I started floating. And here's what I learned from it personally, was that most psychedelic compounds will require some kind of sensory input to really have the experience of that compound. So for instance, if you were to take, if for you, let's say that 2 grams of dried mushrooms is a typical dose for you. If you took that in the flotation tank, you would feel mild euphoria. Like you would know that you had taken the psilocybin, but it would not be nearly as intense as it is in the outside world, where the compound is affecting the way the brain is receiving that sensory input. So in the flotation tank, you have to graduate to pretty heroic doses, to maybe double that, like 4 grams or 5 grams, to really have a strong psychedelic experience, right? So
Interesting.
then under those kind of dosages, you have to ask yourself whether you want to be in a dark box full of salt water, because usually that's not really that comfortable of a setting. So, but here's what I learned about it ultimately, and this includes everything, not only psychoactive plants, but also other more mild compounds like cannabis. We can achieve profound altered states of consciousness in the flotation tank without use of these other compounds. And this
Yeah, you're cutting out there, right there. I can't hear you.
Yeah, I don't have you either.
Okay, I can hear you now.
Okay.
Okay.
Everything froze up.
Yeah. Yep.
Um, so as I was saying, we can reach some profound altered states of consciousness in the float tank without the use of other compounds. The possibilities of doing deep transformational in those altered states is very intriguing, and it's very productive. And I find it most interesting that we can get to these states of consciousness without using other compounds. To me, this is the magic of the float tank, right? Because there are some people that either cannot or will not be able to use psychoactive plants, whether that's just personal responsibilities, um, issues around their job. Maybe people do drug testing for jobs, states where these psychoactive compounds are still illegal. People don't want to take that risk. So here suddenly is the flotation tank as this profound tool for getting this same kind of transformative work done. But you know, there's an off switch, there's a door. You can just, when you're done, you can just get up and get out of the tank, right? Which you don't really have that option with when you're taking a compound. So over the years, like, I've really decided that these things need to stay separate from each other. I think if we want to work in the psychedelic mediums, that's great, and I do that work. But at the same time, here's this other tool that's used in a completely different way, and I think that's the best way to take advantage of it.
That's fascinating, because that's exactly the opposite of what I thought you were going to say. So that's that's interesting. Okay, so I know I saw somewhere online about some work with veterans with PTSD and where the float tanks have helped with that. Are there actual studies rather than just anecdotes? Have there been any larger scale studies recently looking at the effects of float tanks with regard to PTSD or treating other sorts of psychological challenges?
Yeah, there's ongoing studies right now. There's a doctor up in Tulsa. His name is Justin Feinstein, and he works at the I think it's called the Laureate Institute, and they have a whole department in the institute where they have flotation tanks set up that they can wire you up to an EEG and different kind of monitoring devices. And Dr. Feinstein has been doing research studies for the last 5 or 6 years on PTSD, anxiety, eating disorders, addiction, cessation, all kinds of things like that. And those studies are slowly trickling out now. They're starting to be published. If you look on Google Scholar, there's quite a few older scientific studies that were done in the 80s and 90s, and then now the research is starting to develop again new. So yeah. Mm-hmm. And they're finding really, really positive results. I mean, anecdotally, we've seen that in our own float center in Austin. We have a lot of veterans that come to us to float and are just working out their PTSD on their own. it's an interesting alternative to the kind of therapy that they've been receiving in the past, because they're working at their own pace and, not really under the direct direction and influence of a therapist. So they're coming in, they're getting in the float tank. If issues are coming up for them in the tank and they feel like they can process them at that moment, then they do it. And we've seen, heard stories of just incredible breakthroughs happening with PTSD sufferers and people that are, have anxiety issues, and all kinds of issues are being resolved in the tank.
How ballpark? How many veterans with PTSD have you seen in your location in Austin?
We've been open for 8 years. We've seen upward of 50 or 60 veterans that have been at different times. Like people tend to well, this is kind of a downside of our medical and health system in the United States. Like we're basically programmed to take the medicine until the symptoms go away and then stop taking the medicine. So a lot of times when people are floating for very specific reasons, like dealing with anxiety or PTSD, once those feelings go away, then they tend to not float as often.
Right.
We're always encouraging people to make floating a practice, just like you would with yoga or meditation or working out at the gym or anything else, right? Consistency is where we're seeing the most profound benefits. But, if you're coming in to float for a specific reason and it resolves that reason, then great.
It's almost like in my mind, I'm imagining like you or a therapist coming up with like a little ebook, like a short ebook for people who are using the tank for these reasons, and kind of coming up with, okay, this is what we suggest. These are kind of the best practices. Don't stop when your symptoms stop. Continue to come in once a week or once every couple of weeks or once a month or whatever, and sort of, because I know you say often they're not under the care of a therapist, but at the same time, it seems like perhaps some structure would help some of these people get those real longer term lasting benefits, rather than kind of keep on coming in when they have symptoms and sort of,
right,
addressing the urgent thing rather than making kind of a long-term, like permanent or close to permanent, maybe progress.
Yeah, again, we're always encouraging people to look at the float tank as a practice, and always. So it's interesting, right? So around floating, what we find is that consistency is actually more important than quantity. So there's always some balance to be struck here. Like I have a certain amount of time and a certain amount of money that I can dedicate to this practice. So let's, for example, say that that you, Kevin, can afford the time and the money to float twice a month. So what we encourage is that you pick a, say, every other Wednesday afternoon at 2:00, and be as consistent as you can possibly be about that. That's where we see it yielding the most benefit. That's what we're always encouraging people to do. Now, from a program perspective, the industry has historically been pretty hands-off about what they do with other people's floats. So there's been a saying in our industry for a long time: don't program people's floats. Just let them get in there, relax, go into that space, whatever happens, happens, right? Which I adhered to that philosophy for many years. But as time goes on, I'm finding that is not as productive as it could be. And so I am in the process, I've developed a program called transformational flotation. And basically, transformational flotation gives you a methodology by which to measure the progress that you're having in the tank. So it's based roughly on a platform that was developed by a guy named Claire Graves back in the 70s. The system is called Spiral Dynamics. And it basically outlines 9 different points of development in your life. And So like a financial line of development, a spiritual line of development, an interpersonal relationship line of development, and then a methodology by which you can chart the progress in each of those lines of development. And so I took the spiral dynamics model and adjusted it and tweaked it to have it fit into the flotation tank. It's kind of a complicated process, but learning to understand what of brainwave activity you're in, whether you're in beta, alpha, theta, or going into delta, and then working on specific lines of development at specific times to that are cooperative with the way the brain naturally works. And through this kind of program, we're actually now able to quantify on a chart exactly the kind of progress that you're making in the flotation tanks along each of these individual lines of development.
Awesome. And so as far as the brain waves go, people aren't hooked up to a machine to measure their brain waves while they're in the float tank, right?
That's correct. But there are ways that with practice, reasons that we are always reiterating that floating is a practice, you can learn to understand the sensations behind being in these different states of consciousness, these states of brain activity, states of awareness, right? So right now, you and I are both operating in the beta range. So it's a high brain activity, 12 cycles per second or above. As we relax, and we can feel ourselves relax, you will move from beta down into alpha, which is a slower brainwave activity. As you relax more, you'll move into theta. This is where we dream. This is a very visual state. The visual cortex is really being worked and stimulated at this point. And then as you relax, much, much deeper, you can get down into delta. Now, there's an interesting correlation when you look at the science of brain development and the science of human personality development. There's a very interesting correlation. I'll be as brief as I can about this, but this is fascinating. So when we're born until the time that we're about 3.5 years old, our brains can only produce a delta wave. It's very, very slow. It's from 1 to 3.5 or 4 cycles per second. So you see this correlation happening between our age and how active our brains can be. As we get older, 3.5, 4, 5, 6 years old, our brain is developed enough to produce the theta wave, 5 to 7 cycles per second. So there's that correlation again. As we get a little bit older, our brain can produce alpha wave, 8 to 12 cycles per second. Same correlation to age, 8 to 12 years old. And then after 12 years old, our brains are fully developed to the point where we can produce a beta wave. So when we think about now personality and human brain development during that time period, this is what we learn. Our belief systems are formed when we're less than 3 years old. So what we think is right or wrong, good and bad, how we feel we should be treated, how we should treat other people. So our basic belief system already in place and established by the time we're 3 years old. As we get a little bit older, we start to become aware of our sensations. This is how I feel, right? So the ability to identify sensation happens when our brains are now capable of producing theta waves, 5 to 7 cycles per second. As we get a little bit older, we develop emotional intelligence. We start to assign names to the sensations that we have, right? So when I feel like this, it means I love this person. When I feel like this, it means that I'm angry. We start to develop this emotional intelligence, an ability to identify and quantify, put a name to the sensation that we're feeling. And then as we get a little bit older, we move into more pragmatic and practical things like goal setting. What do I want to be when I grow up? What do I want to do in school, right? So the way that the system of transformational flotation works is that you cooperate with your brain. When you first get in the tank and your brain is naturally operating in a beta state, Okay, take that time to go over your shopping list and your to-do list and look at your career goals. As your brain relaxes and you move down into alpha, now switch what it is that you're working on. Now start working on issues of emotional development, emotional intelligence, interpersonal relationships. As your brain slows down more and you move into the theta state, then start working on why it is that you feel this way. Why do I love this person? Why do I feel jealousy when I'm in this situation? Analyzing what it is that brings on the sensations that are your emotions. And ultimately, my goal is to be able to get people to work down in the delta state, very, very slow brainwave activities, in order to work on your belief systems. This idea was all triggered by this kind of new agey statement that we hear all the time, this cliche that says, you create your own reality. You've heard that, right?
Sure, yeah.
But really, I create my own reality? It feels to me like reality is happening to me, right? So I ask myself, what would I have to do to actually change my reality? Well, I would have to get deep in my own psychology. I would have to change my belief systems. I would have to change what I believe is possible. And how are you going to do that? Well, transformational flotation gives you a pathway to get all the way down into those deep, transformative, altered states of consciousness and work on things like your belief system in order to be the author of your own reality.
Right. I know some people, when they hear that thing, we create our own reality. Like even for me, when I hear that, I go, yeah, fucking bullshit. But that's when I think of it in terms of like, we create our own reality as far as like physical reality. Like I can think of whatever I want, and then all of a sudden my actual physical reality is going to shift. Okay. Right. I think that's bullshit. But there's a book behind me called Feeling Good. You can see the edge of it right there. Mm-hmm. By David Burns, one of the pioneers of CBT. And he talks about how our thoughts create our feelings, and often our thoughts are distorted and create these negative feelings. And by looking at the distortions within our thoughts, we can shift the way we feel. And so in that sense, yes, if part of our reality is how we're feeling about something and we're feeling shitty or anxious or depressed or whatever, yes, looking at those thoughts that we're having or those beliefs even deeper, how that's shaping our experience of reality. Yes, we can take control and influence what we're experiencing.
Right. This is, to me, the most fascinating thing about the flotation tank is that we can do this kind of work. I always look at flotation as a process for the psychology. Right?
As a what process?
A hygienic process for the psychology. All the sensory input that we get over the course of our day, it's overwhelming. It keeps us in flight mode all the time, right? And so we just keep taking things and stuffing them down and stuffing them down and stuffing them down because we literally do not have the capacity to process all of it all the time. And we get in a flotation tank, we free up these resources. We allow them to process all of this information that it's been storing, kick out what it doesn't need, file what it does need, kind of like defragmenting the hard drive. And this process, it literally clears the residue off the lens through which we're seeing the world. Now we decisions. We can treat people more kindly. We can be more aware of our surroundings and the kind of things that we're doing with our time and our energy, and just how we look at the world and how we feel about the world and how we see our place in the world. We can now do that through a clearer lens because we're clearing away the residue that's left, all this unprocessed information.
Okay, so let me push back on this a little bit, because this podcast is called Truth Junkie, so I'm always just trying to be as truthful as I can. So I don't think it's, so probably 5 or 6 years ago, I heard Joe Rogan talk about sensory deprivation tanks, and he was talking about it in the same sort of glowing terms that you're talking about it, right? All this potential. And for Joe, it was amazing. And he goes in there. I think he actually used that same metaphor, defragging the hard drive and all that. Uh-huh. So I said, okay, let me try it. So I tried it twice. I think one time it was 90 minutes. One time it was 60 minutes. Okay. I would say I have a moderate background in meditation. I've meditated. I'm not complete. It's not like I've never meditated before. I have some practice. And I went in there with no instruction, except for what I heard like Joe say. And basically for me, it was a little boring.
Mm-hmm.
It was a little boring. It was relaxing, but for me, like 90 minutes was like a long time. It was a long time to sit in there. Maybe I had some level of interesting insight, not a lot, but it was also, just kind of, it was just kind of like that. So what advice would you give someone like me who's tried it once or twice? What the experience we've had was, maybe a little bit bland. Was I in there for too long? And obviously with any modality, I don't care if it's float tank or meditation or psychedelics or whatever, it's not like 100% of the population is going to resonate with 100% of the modalities, right? Mm-hmm. So can you what are your thoughts on that?
Okay, so a couple of things. So 2 floats is not enough to make a determination about the efficacy of the float tanks.
Fair enough.
For several reasons. The first float is sometimes so novel that just the novelty of what you're doing is a distraction. The idea of the float tank is to eliminate distractions, right? So your first float, suddenly you're in this completely foreign environment. There's no gravity. You're floating around in this tank. It's like that in and of itself is causing a lot of brain activity, right? Just experiencing this new environment. So we're always interested in getting that first float out of the way. No matter what, it's going to be, relaxing for you. You're soaking in Epsom salt. You're taking gravity away. You're taking away a lot of sensory input. You're easing the workload on your brain and central nervous system. So it's going to be relaxing. But is it going to be deep and profound? Probably not. The second float, that sensation is less novel now, so you'll be able to go a little bit deeper into your float. And that continues. Somewhere around float 3, 4, 5, it's different for everybody. Somewhere around here, we have an epiphany because our brain figures out what's going on in the tank, and you suddenly go deep, deep into this experience. And people will come out and go, okay, what just happened to me in there? Because I didn't expect that. I thought I knew what floating was about. And we'll hit these plateaus at different times, right? There's another one that happens, somewhere around float 10 or 12, another one that happens around float 30, right? And that never stops happening. Like I literally have lost count. I have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of hours in the flotation tank. And I have given up trying to convince myself that I know what's going to happen in the flotation tank, because we're talking about consciousness exploration now, right? So again, this is why we promote it as a practice. Now here's another thing that I would warn everyone about. In the age of social media, you very rarely will someone take the time to sit down in front of their computer and make a YouTube video or write a blog or make a Facebook post that says, oh yeah, my experience was pretty good. We only hear about the most sensational experiences. I went in the float tank and I saw myself flying through the universe with angel wings and right, yeah, that happens, but does that happen all the time for everybody? Of course not. But that's what we hear about. So we're kind of being socially programmed to think that the only positive or efficacious experience in a float tank is one that finds us on the back of a fire-breathing dragon zooming across the universe. It's just not a practical expectation, and we shouldn't have it. Slow, steady, incremental growth that we get. Little baby steps at a time. We don't need big, disruptive, life-altering things to happen in the tank. We need to make slow, steady progress. And over time, we'll turn around and we'll look and we'll go, wow, look how far I've come.
Right. So it's getting back to that consistency that you talked about before.
Exactly.
And so if someone, so I'm really glad I asked that question then, because I'm sure there's people out there who maybe have never tried it, and then they would do like 2 sessions and go, oh, this is, but now you're saying do it at least, 4 or 5 times, perhaps.
At our float center, we do an introduction package. So all new clients for us can buy a 3-float package really super cheap, because we need to get you through those first 3 floats so that you can get to what floating really is. Like, I'm not going to be able to coach you into having a profound transformative experience in the tank in your first 3 floats. It's just not going to happen. Like, you just have to go through it. Right. After that, that's when the real real big stuff starts to happen.
Do you recommend for beginners to start off with 30-minute, 45-minute floats, if you even offer that?
No, especially in the beginning, you need to stay in there for at least an hour. I actually recommend longer floats. In the beginning, it's going to take you 20, 25 minutes just to calm down, right? Like, our minds are so used to being busy all the time that you'll experience monkey mind in the tank, where the first 20 minutes, your brain is just going like crazy. Like, it's outrageous sometimes how active your brain can be, because your brain and your ego want to be in control. Hey, I'm the ego. I'm running the show here. And suddenly there's nothing for me to do. We're not doing that, right? So your brain will be super active. 25 minutes or so into your float, suddenly you'll shift out of that active brain state, and then all of a sudden it feels like your float the last half hour of your float just went by in no time at all. What caused the boredom that you found in the tank, where it felt like 90 minutes was too long, is the brain just never calmed down. Once the brain calms down, time becomes irrelevant. I've done 8 and 9 hour floats in the tank, and it didn't feel like anything more than my regular 2 hour or 3 hour float.
I don't know. It felt to me like when I was in there, I was pretty damn calm, and that my brain was calm. I was just a little bit bored. But again, it seems like what you're saying is I just needed more floats in the tank to get past that.
Well, so let's tease that out a little bit, because this is an interesting thing. So, like, I was bored because my brain wasn't active, because my brain wasn't keeping me entertained, right? It is like, that's the modern mind, feeling like something always needs to be happening. Something always needs to be keeping me busy, keeping me entertained. It's only when you enter these like really deep states of consciousness that's where the really entertaining stuff happens. But you have to learn to relax deep enough to get into those altered states of consciousness. Again, it's a practice.
Right. So you'd probably recommend, ideally, for someone starting out, 1 60-minute session a week for 4 weeks in a row or 5 weeks in a row.
If you can do that, one or 2 floats a week is a great way to get started. And then you can kind of determine like whether that's something that you can maintain at that level. I mean, some people can, some people can't. What we don't want to do is have the money and time become the primary stress around floating, right? We're walking kind of a fine edge here. It's like, we don't want you coming into the tank going, man, I don't even know if I can afford this, and I've got a really busy day. Can I take this? Right? It's counterproductive. So we got to find that balance for everybody. But if you can float once a week for the first month, you'll get a real sense of what floating can do for you.
Question for you. So I think I heard you say somewhere out there in cyberspace that floating increases the amount of neurotransmitters in the brain.
Yeah.
If that's true, can you talk a little bit about what study showed this, which neurotransmitters, and how do we know that this is a good thing?
I can't remember the name of the study or the doctors that did it. There's actually been several, and they are available online if you just Google this. But basically what we've learned is that big neurotransmitters, serotonin, melatonin, there's a whole variety of major and more minor, lesser known neurotransmitters that are being produced in the brain, as well as there's an endochromatic response. So your producing endorphins as well. This comes back to the thing about freeing up resources to allow the body to do background work that it doesn't ordinarily get to do, right? So in the tank, we can do things like neurotransmitter production, endorphin production, cellular regeneration. Like that's one of the primary uses of the tank, is for a lot of athletes who are using it for recovery after workouts and competitions and things like that. So there's the physical recovery benefits. There's also the chemical recovery, right? So we do extra digestion, our blood pressure lowers, again, back neurotransmitter production, endorphin production, things like that. So basically, it's the body's opportunity to balance itself. It's not going to overproduce neurotransmitters. It's going to bring neurotransmitter levels up to an optimal rate.
Okay, right.
What the body wants and needs, what it determines it needs.
Right. So if there's any deficiencies, this is an opportunity for the body to reset back to optimal levels.
Right. Throughout the all of your body chemistry and all of your physiological functions.
Has COVID affected float tanks?
It did for a little while. Yeah. For the first few months, people stopped floating. Well, we closed down, right? Most float centers were closed for the first several months. As it turns out, the recommendations that were being given to the floating industry by the CDC and by municipal health regulators were less than what we had normally been doing anyway. The flotation industry has self-governed for so many years. Like, our standards are so high for hygiene in a float center, like how we're keeping the solution clean, how keeping the surfaces clean. We've been operating at this high standard for decades now. And of course, floating is the ultimate social distancing, right? You're in there by yourself. You're not with other people. So the main considerations that we had to deal with were surfaces in the showers, the handles in and out of the tank, whether or not any of the virus was remaining airborne or on the surface of the interior surfaces of the float tank. So we just started doing things like fogging the inside of the tank with hydrogen peroxide. Works really, really well. And some natural antivirals like rosemary oil we found to be really effective. And other than that, we're just being really cautious with people coming in. We're taking people's temperatures. It's getting busy now. Like, we're now as busy as ever. For whatever reason, are having incredible breakthroughs right now. I think the baseline anxiety level in this country has gone up in the last several years. And people are really finding the tank to be an effective way to combat that anxiety and bring that base level of anxiety down. We're hearing more incredible stories coming from floaters right now than we've ever heard in the whole time we've been operating.
Interesting.
Yeah, it's really cool.
Interesting. And so if someone wanted to find a float tank, first of all, I mean, are there dangers to going to a float tank spa that maybe is not following guidance as closely as others? And how do you know the difference between someone who is really following guidance and someone who isn't? Although I would imagine these days with COVID, basically everyone has to, otherwise they're going to be shut down, right?
Yeah, for sure. Now, I would read online reviews of your local float center just to see what people are saying about it. For the most part, people who are coming to float, they will notice whether or not a float center is clean. For the vast majority of commercial float centers in the US, cleanliness is priority number one. Right? You are asking people to get naked in your business. So people have to be very, very comfortable with the level of cleanliness in your place. And most float centers take that very, very seriously. The floating industry has an association, the Float Tank Association, that puts out guidelines that are updated regularly about best practices and in float centers, and most float centers adhere to that religion. So I think for the most part, if a float center is getting good reviews, it's going to be good. Realizing now that like literally only one or two things that can live in float tank water, it's very unfriendly to life in terms of bacteria, algae, pollutants that might get into the flotation tank. In our flotation tanks, there's 1,200 pounds of Epsom salt in 300 gallons of water. So it's very, very unlikely that anything's going to actually live in that water.
Right. And for those of the people out in podcast land that have never experienced a spa like that, you take a shower before you get in the water anyways. So,
right. Yeah. We want everybody as clean as possible before they get in the tank, and you float naked. So you're not bringing in bacteria or soap from a bathing suit, right? Like that, introducing a bathing suit into the water is the worst thing that you can do.
Interesting. And then do you flush the water out afterwards? How does that work?
Yeah, what's that?
Do you, between users, is it fresh water?
No, but it's filtered. So most flotation tanks are filtered using a process of hydrogen peroxide and UV light, as well as a paper medium filter. And the CDC requires that we turn over the entire contents of the tank 3.5 times between each floater. Most commercial float centers can almost double that. So in the amount of time that it takes us to clean up the room after you finish using it, before the next person comes in, we do a full clean, top to bottom, wipe every surface, mop all the floors, clean all the walls, like everything gets clean. And that takes usually about a half an hour to do that between floaters, between sessions. And during that half hour, the pump will be running at full speed the entire time. So like in our situation at Zero Gravity in Austin, we're getting about 5.5 to 6 full volumetric turnovers in that half hour.
Got it. And where's the state of the float tank industry at this point? Is it expanding? Is it going into new cities? Is it pretty level? And is there anything new and exciting going on?
It's interesting. We were very active for a long time, from about 2011, 2012 on. There were several hundred float centers opening around the world, lots of new float tank manufacturers, lots of new people getting into the industry. That kind of plateaued about 2 years ago. We're still seeing small increases. More float centers are still opening. It's a little uncertain what's going to happen around COVID. I know that a lot of places that were on the edge have closed down permanently now. But those float centers that were already doing well and were already busy, we're either maintaining or even expanding in some cases. So I'm optimistic about it. I think as more and more people find out about it and find out about the different benefits that the float tank provides, I think we'll see a continued growth.
Interesting. I want to ask you about psychedelics.
Yeah, I love that subject.
Separate from float tanks, but I also want to wrap up this call in about less than 10 minutes.
Okay.
So let me maybe I'll just ask one question, which is, there's been so much work. I know Tim Ferriss has helped fund some of the Johns Hopkins research on using psychedelics to treat basically medicine-resistant depression, and also PTSD. I know Oregon has just legalized the use of psilocybin mushrooms. By the way, does that mean, and I've watched Goop, Gwyneth Paltrow, right? They went down to Jamaica and they did this group. Did you ever see that episode of?
You're your signal froze up. Can you say that again?
Yeah. So, Gwyneth Paltrow has this Goop, documentary on Netflix, and they went down to Jamaica and they all did this group psilocybin experience down there. What are your recommendations as far as if someone is interested in having a professionally led group psychedelic experience at this point? Do people still have to leave the country and do it in Jamaica or South America or something to make that happen?
To make it happen legally,
right?
Yes. Now, in states where they've legalized psilocybin, there were already psychedelic assisted therapy sessions going on. They were just happening underground. I personally don't have a lot of experience with that specific part of working with psychedelics. I work with ayahuasca. I am an ayahuasquero, an ayahuasca shaman. And so I facilitate and lead groups of people through the ayahuasca experience. Very beneficial, highly productive retreats that happen around ayahuasca work. And if that is something that you feel would be beneficial, I would really recommend doing it. But ayahuasca is intense. It's not for everyone. I mean, ayahuasca is for everyone, but not everyone should drink ayahuasca. That's what I'm really trying to say, right? You do not have to leave the country to drink ayahuasca. To drink it legally, you do. We used to run retreats in Guatemala until COVID shut down the travel. Now we just do them very covertly, very quietly, in a very traditional way here in the States. It's not, I don't know how much it's on the radar of law enforcement. Ayahuasca is not something that's going to be abused, right? Like you're not going to just like get some ayahuasca and some friends drinking. It's not that kind of an experience, right? Like it needs to be done in the context of a ceremony. It needs to be done under the guidance and facilitation of a trained shaman, a trained facilitator. So in many ways, I think it's, in terms of ayahuasca, I think it's safer really to stay in the country and do it, because when you go down to Peru at this point, there's a lot of charlatans, a lot of scam artists down there that are just looking for any gringo who might want to drink ayahuasca. You don't know what's in it. You don't know who's giving it to you. It's gotten completely out of control. If you go to Iquitos in Peru, people up on the street. If you're a gringo walking down the street, it's literally like every 10 feet somebody's offering you ayahuasca, wachuma, toa, and you just never know. And they believe that Americans just want a big fireworks show. They just want a big psychedelic visual experience. So they're putting other plants in the ayahuasca to increase the visual and hallucinatory part of the ayahuasca. It's moved very far away from the traditional use and the use that I was trained to do. So I just don't think it's worth the risk to go down there right now. The travel time, the expense, the exposure to diseases and unclean water and unscrupulous people. There's plenty of really good ayahuasqueros that are pouring medicine in the United States, and it's not that hard to find.
Got it. Yeah, we could have a whole podcast just on that. Maybe
yes, good.
I can twist your arm in the future sometime. We could do a round 2 just on that topic. Well, Kevin, thanks so much for talking to me today. And if people want to learn more about your float tanks in Austin, or where to learn more about everything related to float tanks, like what resources would you share with them?
So if you want to learn about flotation tanks, you can check out zerogravityinstitute.com. And there's links there to different studies, and that's just a good place to start. zerogravityinstitute.com.
Mm-hmm.
If you want to know more about doing medicine work, ayahuasca, our organization actually offers a full range of shamanic services, so energy clearing, Reiki, shamanic consulting, cacao ceremonies, dietas. That information you can find at vidabrillante.org. That's VIDABRILLANTE, Spanish for bright life, vidabrillante.org. And you can contact us through that to get information about different shamanic services that we offer.
Awesome. Do you do, are you active on social media or no?
Not so much.
Okay.
I think there's a lot wrong with social media, so I don't really engage in that way. A little bit with the Float Center, not really at all with the Vida Brillante work.
Got it.
The shamanic work, we come from a very traditional place, so we tend to serve in very small communities. We have pockets of communities scattered around the country that we travel to service those individual communities, and we tend to serve those communities in a very closed, very traditional way.
Awesome. Sounds great. Well, thanks again, Kevin, for your time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Yeah, it was really great to talk to you. I appreciate the opportunity. Thank you for having me.